I work at a café downtown. During the day, the area looks almost charming. Brick sidewalks, small storefronts, students, office workers moving in and out. But once it gets dark, the atmosphere shifts. There are several shelters within walking distance, and the drug problem in the area isn't subtle. If you work there long enough, you learn to treat strange behavior as part of the background noise. I've been behind that counter for 3 years. I've been insulted, shouted at, and occasionally threatened. Most of the time, it's just words. You learn not to react. This happened in late January. Winter here gets dark early, and when there's snow on the ground, the city feels different, brighter, yet emptier. Sound travels further, footsteps echo. The shift had been normal up until the early afternoon. A guy walked in, early 20s, red hair, thin build, worn jacket. He didn't order anything. He just sat near the window. At first, I thought he was on the phone, but he wasn't holding one. He was muttering under his breath, repeating phrases I couldn't quite make out. His hands were moving slightly, almost like he was counting something or tracing shapes in the air. A few customers started glancing over. The tension was subtle but noticeable. After a few minutes, his muttering got louder. He stood up abruptly and began pacing between the tables, still talking, now clearly addressing someone who wasn't there. I walked over and kept my voice steady. I told him he needed to leave for the day. He stopped pacing and looked directly at me. Not aggressively, not wildly, just intensely focused. He stepped closer than necessary and said, quietly and clearly, "This is all a game. I could end it with one finger." He didn't shout it. That was what made it unsettling. He said it like a simple fact. I didn't argue. I just repeated that he needed to go. After a few seconds, he turned and walked out. I didn't think much of it. Comments like that aren't rare where I work. We closed at 9 that night. I locked the door and started walking toward the parking garage where I keep my car. It's about 6 blocks away. Normally, I don't mind the walk. Snow had fallen earlier and now covered most of the sidewalks. The streetlights reflected off it, casting a dull yellow glow. The streets were nearly empty. About 2 blocks in, I heard a sharp exhale behind me, almost like a hiss. I turned, but there was no one there, just wind moving between the buildings. I told myself I was overthinking it. I kept walking. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps, soft but distinct, the crunch of snow under boots. At first, I didn't turn around. I assumed it was just another pedestrian, but when I sped up slightly, the footsteps did the same. I looked back. He was there, about half a block behind me. Same jacket, same posture, walking directly in my direction. Something dropped in my stomach before the fear fully registered. I walked faster. So did he. The entrance to the parking garage was just ahead. I pushed through the stairwell door instead of waiting for the elevator and started climbing quickly. Halfway up the first flight, I heard the door below slam shut. It wasn't the wind. I didn't stop. I reached my level, crossed the concrete floor, and unlocked my car with hands that were shaking more than I expected. For a moment, I wondered if maybe I had misread the situation. Then he stepped out from behind one of the concrete pillars. This time, there was no calm focus in his expression. He looked furious. He locked eyes with me and started running. He reached the car just as I got inside and locked the doors. He slammed both hands against the driver's side window, shouting. I couldn't make out every word through the glass, but I didn't need to. I threw the car into reverse too quickly, nearly hitting a column, then turned toward the exit. As I passed him, he stepped toward the vehicle again, as if considering throwing himself against it. I didn't look back. When I got home, I sat in my driveway for a long time before going inside. My hands were still trembling after everything was technically over. The next morning, I reported the incident. I gave a description. They told me someone matching that description had been picked up before for aggressive behavior. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. What stayed with me wasn't the screaming in the garage or the impact of his hands against the window. It was the way he said that sentence earlier that day, calm, measured. This is all a game. I still work at the same café. I still park in the same garage. But I don't wear headphones on my walk anymore. And whenever I hear footsteps behind me in the snow, I turn around immediately. Because sometimes 6 blocks is all it takes to realize you were never alone. A few years ago, I worked at a pub about 2 miles from my house. It was in a rural area, mostly woods and open fields. No neighborhoods, no steady traffic, just a narrow road that disappeared into darkness once you left town. That night, my shift ended around 11. It had been unusually good, tip-wise. I had close to $400 in cash in my pocket, more than I normally carried. I remember counting it before I left, feeling satisfied and maybe a little distracted by how well the night had gone. Between the pub and my house, there was exactly one streetlight. It stood about a quarter mile from the building. The rest of the walk was completely unlit. And that night was especially dark. It was near a new moon, and the sky was covered with clouds. Out where I lived, there wasn't much light pollution to begin with. Once you stepped beyond that single streetlight, it felt like walking into something thick and endless. Not long after I left the pub, a car passed me slowly. That alone wasn't unusual. Cars did drive that road from time to time. About a quarter mile ahead, though, the car slowed down and stopped. I stopped walking too. The car just sat there. After a few minutes, it began moving again and disappeared around a bend. I told myself I was overthinking it and kept walking. A couple of minutes later, I saw headlights again. The same car came back in the opposite direction, creeping along at a slow pace. It passed me, continued a short distance, then slowed down again. This time, my stomach tightened. The car made a U-turn and started coming back toward me, with the lights off. That was the moment I knew this wasn't random. I didn't have a cell phone at the time. There were no houses nearby, no sidewalks, no one around. The pub was now behind me, and my house was still more than a mile away. I was exposed in the open. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself not to run immediately. I didn't want to draw attention. When the car got close enough, I stepped off the road and moved quickly into the woods. There were no trails, just brush, fallen branches, and uneven ground. I crouched behind a dense cluster of bushes, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. With the headlights off and trees blocking my view, I couldn't see the road clearly anymore. I listened. The woods were unnaturally quiet. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. Every small sound felt amplified. A branch shifting in the wind sounded like a footstep. My breathing seemed too loud. Then I heard a car door close. The sound echoed in a way that made my chest tighten instantly. A few seconds later, another door closed. That was worse than the engine idling. It meant someone had gotten out. I stayed completely still. I remember thinking how absurd it was that I had been worried about carrying cash only minutes earlier. Now I was just hoping not to be seen at all. I heard movement on the gravel road, slow steps, not running, not rushing, just deliberate. I couldn't see anything, but in that level of darkness, your imagination fills in what your eyes can't. I pictured someone scanning the tree line, trying to adjust to the dark, trying to listen for breathing. I don't know how long I stayed there. It might have been 10 minutes. It might have been longer. Time doesn't move normally when you're afraid. Eventually, I heard the car doors again, then the engine, then tires on pavement fading into the distance. I didn't move right away. I waited until another car passed on the road with its headlights fully on before I stood up. When I stepped back onto the pavement, the road was empty. I didn't continue home. I ran back toward the pub. When I told my boss what had happened, he didn't hesitate. He said I was never walking home alone at night again. From then on, someone always gave me a ride. Nothing else ever came of it. No police report, no follow-up, no explanation. But I still think about that car sometimes, about how it turned its lights off, about how it stopped twice, and about how exposed I was on a road with only one streetlight. That was the first time I truly understood how vulnerable you are in complete darkness. And ever since then, I don't trust a quiet road at night, especially when there's only one place on it that offers any light at all. I'm a bartender, and I usually head home somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. At that hour, the city feels different. The noise dies down, traffic thins out, and the only people still moving around are the ones who either work late or don't really have anywhere to go. That Monday night had been especially slow. We were already in closing mode. The kitchen had shut down, the music was off, and half the lights were dimmed. My manager and I were wiping down the bar and getting ready to close out the register. When the front door opened, I didn't think much of it at first. In a downtown bar, people wander in until the very last minute. Sometimes it's someone looking for one more drink. Sometimes it's someone just trying to get out of the cold. Usually, all it takes is a polite explanation that we're closed. My manager called out right away and told her we were shutting down and couldn't serve anyone else. The woman who had walked in didn't respond. She kept moving forward at a slow, steady pace, staring straight ahead as if she hadn't heard him at all. At first, I assumed she simply hadn't caught what he said, but as she got closer to the bar, it became clear that wasn't the case. She didn't look like the typical homeless person we sometimes see come in. Her clothes were worn but not torn. She wasn't visibly dirty. What stood out immediately was her face. Her skin had a very pale gray tone to it. Not pale like someone who hasn't seen the sun, and not dirty or weathered. It was a muted, almost colorless gray, as if all warmth had drained out of it. Her skin also looked tight, almost smooth to the point of being unnatural, with very little visible expression. On her chin, there was a tattoo, 4 thin lines starting at one point and extending downward along her neck in a subtle, geometric pattern. She wasn't wearing shoes. My manager repeated that we were closed and told her she couldn't be inside barefoot. She didn't argue. She didn't even acknowledge him. She simply walked up to the bar, pulled out a chair, and sat down as if everything was normal. There was no aggression in her movements, no urgency, no frustration. It was almost as if she was operating on a different timeline from the rest of us. Then she slowly turned her head toward me, not toward my manager, who had been speaking to her, not toward the bouncer standing closer to her than I was, toward me. her eyes locked onto mine in a way that felt deliberate. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She just stared for several seconds, and then, in a quiet, even voice, she said, "I like you." There was no flirtation in it, no obvious threat either. It sounded like a simple statement. Under the bar, we have a panic button that sends an immediate alert to the police. My hand was already resting near it, and at that point I kept my finger there, trying to stay calm. Our bouncer stepped forward and placed his hand gently on her shoulder, asking her to leave. The moment he touched her, she began to scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear when someone is startled. It was sharp, high, and continuous, almost mechanical in how steady it was. What made it worse was that she didn't thrash or flail. She remained seated at first, staring straight at me while screaming, her expression barely changing. The bouncer tried to lift her from the chair. She didn't fight in a typical way, but her body felt heavy and rigid, like she was resisting without actually moving. The scream didn't stop. I pressed the panic button. The sound filled the room in a way that made everything else fade for a moment. Even after the police arrived and began escorting her out, she kept her eyes fixed in my direction. One of the officers told us quietly that they were familiar with her and that she had severe mental health issues. Apparently, this wasn't the first time she had caused a disturbance somewhere nearby. After everything settled down and we finally locked up, the bar felt strangely hollow. The silence was heavier than usual. What stayed with me wasn't the scream. It wasn't her gray skin, or the tattoo, or the fact that she had been barefoot. It was the way she focused on me. There were several people in that room. My manager had addressed her directly. The bouncer had been physically closest to her. But from the moment she sat down, her attention had settled on me and never shifted. There wasn't hatred in her expression. There wasn't obvious anger. If anything, it felt like recognition. I still work at the same bar, and I still close late at night. But now, whenever the door opens near closing time, I look up immediately. And if someone holds my gaze just a second longer than normal, I notice it. Because sometimes what unsettles you the most isn't the scream. It's the silence right before it. I used to work overnight shifts at Walmart for a while. My schedule was 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. If you've ever worked in a big box store at night, you know how different it feels compared to daytime. The lights are still bright, the aisles are still endless, but the building feels hollow. Sounds travel farther, shopping carts echo, conversations feel louder than they should. Most weeknights were quiet. A few regulars would come through, truck drivers grabbing snacks, people getting off late shifts, the occasional insomniac wandering around with no real purpose. After a while, you start recognizing faces, but every Friday night, without fail, this older woman would come in with two young girls. It was always between 10 and 11. Same time, same routine. The woman was loud, not just talkative, loud. Her normal speaking voice sounded like yelling. She narrated everything she did, commented on products, called out to her kids from across entire sections. If she asked one of us for help reaching something, it sounded like she was addressing a crowded auditorium instead of a nearly empty store. At first it was just annoying, then it became expected. She would grab a cart and start filling it, and not in a normal, weekly grocery run kind of way. She'd pull items from completely different sections, throw pillows, cleaning supplies, frozen dinners, random toys, lamps, towels, sometimes even electronics. There didn't seem to be any logic to it, It wasn't like she was comparison shopping or building toward anything specific. She would stay for hours. I would clock in at 10, see her come in shortly after, and sometimes she would still be wandering the store at 4 or 5 in the morning. The two girls followed her quietly most of the time. They didn't act out. They didn't complain. They just trailed behind her cart while she kept talking loudly about whatever she happened to be holding at the moment. And then, every single Friday, it ended the same way. At it for a moment. Like she was at it for a moment. Like she was considering something. And then walk out of the store with her daughters. No attempt to check out. No argument about prices. No scene at the register. She would just leave. At first, we assumed she didn't have the money, but she never even approached the front. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't hesitation. It felt intentional. After a few weeks, I started paying closer attention. Not because I was scared. It wasn't that kind of creepy. It was more unsettling in a quiet way. It felt like a ritual. A few hours of collecting things from every part of the building, arranging them in a cart, and then walking away as if the entire process had been the point, not the purchase. I once followed at a distance just to see how it ended. She stopped near the middle of a random aisle, rested both hands on the cart handle, stared down at everything she had gathered, and then simply let go. No frustration, no disappointment. She turned and walked toward the exit with her kids, like she had finished what she came to do. Eventually, she stopped coming. There was no big final night, no explanation. One Friday, she just didn't show up. Working overnights, you see other things too. One night, a woman came in who was clearly under the influence of something. You could see it in her face immediately. Her eyes were unfocused, her movements slow and disconnected. She pushed a cart down the aisle without really looking at anything. With her was a little boy, maybe 7 years old. I only saw them once, but that moment stuck with me more than anything. The boy kept talking to her in a calm, steady voice. He wasn't crying. He wasn't yelling. He just kept saying things like, "Hey, can you hear me? It's me. I'm right here. And why aren't you talking to me?" She didn't respond. Not once. He repeated himself like he was used to it. That wasn't creepy in the horror sense. It was heavy. Overnight shifts don't scare you with ghosts or monsters. They show you people who move differently when the rest of the world is asleep. Sometimes it's a woman who fills a cart every Friday night, and leaves it behind like she completed some invisible task. Sometimes it's a kid trying to reach someone who isn't really there anymore, even though she's standing right in front of him. I don't work there anymore, but whenever I walk through a big store late at night and see a shopping cart abandoned in the middle of an aisle, I always think about her, because some people don't come in to buy anything. Sometimes they come in just to go through the motions of it. And when the lights are that bright and the building is that empty, the smallest patterns start to feel bigger than they are. Not scary, just strange enough that you never quite forget them.